Hi and welcome to another video here on my channel UiPath with Jeppe. In this video we're taking a look at the new and updated attended framework. The attended framework makes it possible for you to build attended automation in a uniform way so that both you as a developer will have an easier time building the automations, but the user will also have a uniform experience from one automation to another. And that's a huge advantage if you really want the users to adapt this notion of attended automation. Don't forget to like the video if you like the video, and also subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified of new videos when I put them out. But without any more delays, let's just get to it. So I'm inside Studio and I'm going to start a new project, and I'll go here to the More Templates page, and in the search box I'm just going to type in attended, and I'll choose the attended framework template. That is version 2.0.2, that is new as of last week, and I'll click Use Template. I will call the project My File Mover and click Create. And once the project is ready, I'm going to click the Open Main Workflow link here in the middle. And what we'll see in the main workflow file is, first of all, a parallel activity. And inside of that parallel activity, you have two other sequences running, well, in parallel. And one of them is sort of the main process, and we'll get back to that in a second. And the other one is a sequence that runs this show status window SAML file. And that's a little status window that will tell you what exactly is the attended automation doing as it is working. But the bulk of the work is done here in the main process sequence, and I'll get back to that in a lot more detail a little bit later. But for now, we'll just have a quick look at the project structure here on the left. And what we have over here is a couple of folders and some files that I just want to take a very quick look at. In the Continue Workflows folder, we have one single workflow right now. It's called Process SAML. If you have worked with the Robotic Enterprise Framework, you may recognize that as the file that does the actual processing in your automation. We also have the Framework Workflows folder, and that contains a number of workflows that are part of the framework. This is the plumbing of this template. And we're not really going to edit these in this video. So we'll just close the folder and move on to some of the files down here in the root folder. We have one called configurutility.saml. We have one called displayInputForm.saml. We have form-button-action.saml. And of course, we have the main SAML, which is also the entry point for the automation. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to this configurutility file. And once we've opened it, I'm going to go up to the Run menu, and I'm going to run this single file. I'm not debugging it. I'm not running the entire project. I'm running this single configurutility file. What that'll do is it's going to display a form to us. And in this form, you actually create a configuration file. And this is more or less the equivalent of the Excel config file that you use in the Robotic Enterprise Framework. In the attended framework, that has been replaced by a JSON file, and this form helps you create that JSON file. We can set up assets, constants, settings. We can also define exceptions and the messages that they display. And we have the option of creating what are called form defaults. And in fact, we're going to create just one form default now. I'll click Add Another, and then I'll define as the field key, we'll call it From folder. And as the value, I'll just paste in the name of a folder that's sitting on my desktop. You can see it sitting right there. And I'll click Save, and I will click Save to exit the form. What that did is it created a JSON file, and we can see that JSON file inside of the data folder here, in the supporting folder, and then in the config.json file. If we open that, we should be able to see here at the beginning the From folder that we just defined inside of the form, with the value that I pasted in for the folder on my desktop. Next, I'm going to open the display input form file. And inside of that, we have this create form activity. And that's a form activity that's also very important to the attended framework. I'll click the Open Form Designer. And that will display this form. And let me just make a few modifications to that and then explain what exactly it does. First of all, I'm going to delete this top table here. I'm going to delete the Select Output folder. There we go. And then I'm going to move these buttons a little bit. The cancel button I'll move here. the continue button I'll move here. Then I'll copy the continue button and paste it in and move the copy over to this next cell. We have 8 columns here, and I'm going to modify that by clicking the edit button and saying 5 columns. Click save, and then I'm going to make some modifications to these 2 buttons. The first button, I'm going to say copy files as the label, and in the field key tab here I'm going to write copy files. This field key is extremely important later on when we determine what is the automation actually going to do. So just make a note that I changed the field key on the button to copy files. Then on the other button, I'm going to also edit the label to move files, and then I'm going to modify the field key to move files. Again, now we have 2 buttons, each with their own label and also with 2 different field keys. One is copy files and one is move files. Next, I'm going to add a couple of controls, these file folder path pickers. I'll insert it here. I'll select that this should be a folder picker, and then I'll write in as the label from folder. And I will go to the field key tab again, and we can see that it has actually automatically added the from folder field key value. So I'll click save. I'll add another one. I will call it the to folder. Make sure it is a folder picker, and also go and check that the field key has been changed to folder. And I'll click save. So if I do a preview of this form now, we can see that this is a very simple form. It'll let us pick a folder as the from folder and a folder as the to folder, and then we can click the copy files button, and that should then copy files from the from folder to the to folder, and the same with the move files button. Now I'm just going to exit the preview and save the form and close the form designer. Now in this automation we're not actually going to do the actual copying of the files. It's just to show you, what was the intention of this automation, but I'm not going to bother building the actual file copying right now. So now the third file that we want to look at is the form button action file. This contains, as the most important part, this switch statement. And this switch statement actually does different things depending on what button you clicked inside of the form. So the display input form is the first thing that you're going to see when you run the automation. Then you're going to pick the folders, then you're going to click the copy button or the move button. And depending on what button you click, this is going to take different actions. So inside of this switch statement, we have one case right now. We have one called case continue. Well, we're going to change the case continue to case copy files. And this is the field key value that we set on the button. So if we have a case for copy files and one for move files, then we can execute a different SAML file for each of those 2 actions. So right now it's only processing one thing, and it's running this process SAML file. If we go to the continue workflows folder and rename that to copy files, then if you press the copy button, then this file is going to be run. I'm going to copy this. Then I'm going to add another case statement, and that will be, of course, move files, which corresponds to the field key value on the move files button inside of the form. So I'll paste in the activity, and since we only have one file in our continue workflows folder, I'm going to go up here and copy that file and paste it in, and we'll rename that file as move files. Then inside the switch statement, I am going to change that to move files. So now we have 2 buttons, each with their own action and with their own field key, and those field keys define which one of these cases will be executed, and in turn which one of these files will be run. If we open the copy files file, what we can see it contains is this broadcast message activity. And this broadcast message activity uses something called IPC, inter-process communication, to talk to a parallel process. And in our case, the parallel process, well, let's go back to main here. The parallel process is this thing over here that displays the status window. So when inside of the copy files SAML file, we broadcast a message to that window, we can define that it should display that we are actually right now copying files. Just to make sure we see that message, I'm going to go to the snippets section, go to the delay folder, and insert a 3-second delay. And in the same way, I'm going to go to the move files file. And in here, we also have a broadcast message because this is a copy of the copy files file. And we are going to change that to moving files. And then also I'll go to the snippets and insert a 3-second delay. So now when we click the button inside of the input form, we determine are we going to copy files or move files. Then that determines inside of the form button action which of these two files in the continue workflows folder is being run, and that determines again what is being broadcast back to that status window. So that's basically the build for this time. There's a lot more explaining, and I'll get to that in a second, but let's try and run the process. I'll click run. And what we'll see is Studio minimizes as it should, and will be shown the input form that we edited just a few minutes ago. There we go, there's the input form. Up here in the upper left, we have the status window. I'll just move that down so we can see it a little bit better. And we can see that in the from folder, we have a default value, and that's the default value we set up inside of that config utility SAML file. If I now select a to folder, and we'll just go to my desktop here and select the to folder and click OK. Now we have a from folder and a to folder. And if I click copy files now, what you should notice is not anything happening down here because, as I said, we haven't built any file moving logic. But in the status window, we should see that the process starts, and we should see that copying files message for about 3 seconds. So let's try and click that. Process started, copying files, 1, 2, 3, and the process completes and shows us a result form. That result form shows us that, well, everything went well because we didn't really do anything. But we can now choose to either repeat the process if we have more files to move, or close the automation altogether. We're going to try to repeat the process. And now I'm going to click the other button. So we see the input form, and now we have the values already filled out because it saves whatever we put into the to folder in a configuration file on the user machine. So if I click the move files button now, we should see the status window again say moving files for 1, 2, 3 seconds. Process completes, and it shows us the result form that everything went well. Now if we click the close button, the automation closes, the status window disappears, and we're back into Studio. Now the last thing I want to do before I move into a couple of PowerPoints, and it's not going to be as boring as you might fear, I'm going to deploy or publish this process. The first thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to go to the project settings, and I'm going to mark the process as PIP ready. And PIP is a really cool feature. It's short for picture in picture. And I'll show you how that works in just a second. I'll just enable it, click OK, and I'll click Publish. And we'll just click Publish here. And in a second, we should see that everything went well with the publishing. And it did, so we press OK. And I'll just minimize Studio for a few minutes. And what we can do is we can open our UiPath Assistant here. And we can see I don't have any automations in here. Then I'll go to my orchestrator. And we can also see that inside my automations folder, we don't have any processes. But I click the processes page, and we add a new process. We select the package. I only have one, that's my file mover. And I'll just click next, next, create, and close. What that should do is, if we now go back to UiPath Assistant, there we go, it actually shows us the My File Mover automation. Now if I run this, we should get more or less the same experience that we just saw when we ran it from Studio. So let's see if the input form pops up. Indeed it does. We also have the status window, and if I click copy files, it'll do exactly what it did before, show us the copying file status message, and when it is done, not copying any files, it's going to show us the results form that we can then either repeat or close. And I'm just going to close it this time. Now, if I go back to Assistant, what I can do is I can click here and show the process details. And in the process details, I can choose a number of options. I can choose to hide the inputs. And as you saw when I just ran it, the default values for the two folders are already set. So I can actually choose to hide that form, and then the automation will just skip right to the processing when I run it. I can also choose to hide the messages. That means we won't see the status window with the updates from within the processing files. We can also choose to hide the result form. So basically, if we check all of these, the automation will run completely silently. Now, the process will still run in the foreground unless we choose to run it picture in picture. And I'm going to do that now. What this should mean, if I save, close, and run the automation, is that the automation starts up in this picture in picture window, which is a different window session from my main session. That means that I could, for example, open Notepad or whatever and be working on another project while the automation is working in the background. It also means, since I chose to hide the input window, that it's not even going to show that input form with the two folder pickers. It's not going to show that before it runs the automation. But we should see in just a second that it shows the status window here. It's now copying the files and then shows the complete process complete status. And then it also shows us the result form. And these two, both the status window and the result form, are shown in the main session. So even though the automation itself is running in the background, we will still be notified in the foreground what the automation has been doing. And that's a real strength of this version of the Attended Framework, is that you can run stuff in the background or in the picture-in-picture session and still be notified in the foreground of what is going on. So that was a quick run through of how you actually build an automation. But now let's dig a little bit deeper into how the framework is structured. So the overall architecture of this framework is as follows. Once you start the automation, you run into this state called init-config, and this is where we load the data from the config files. If that goes well, if it's successful, then we proceed to another state called the user input form and process state. That is where the user input form is displayed, and depending on what action you take inside of that, the process is then executed. If that goes well, then we go to the result form, and that can display the success message that we just saw a minute ago, or it can display an error if an error occurs. Now inside the result form, as you saw, we could choose to repeat the process, and that takes us back to the user input form and process state. And once we're done repeating and repeating and repeating, then we can choose to close the automation, and that takes us to the end process state. And this then is the happy path through the template. Now things can happen along the way, of course. For example, in the init config state, we might see a system exception. And if a system exception occurs, then we transition to the result form, where again, as I said, the error message can be displayed. That can also happen if something happens in the user input and process state. If a system exception occurs, we are taken to the result form where the error is displayed. Now, if you're familiar with the concept of system and business rule exceptions, of course, during the processing, a business rule exception can also occur. That will also take us to the result form where the error message will be displayed. Finally, in the user input form and process state, we have the option of canceling the process altogether. And if we do that, we go to the end process state and nothing more happens. And that's the basic architecture of this template. So if I switch back into Studio, we can see that in the main process sequence here, if I double click that, we can actually see exactly this diagram that I just showed you in PowerPoint. We have the init config state, we have the user input form and process state, and then depending on how you transition out of that, we can see the result form and the end process, and then we have the cancel transitions and the system exceptions and so forth. And so while the framework template here, the main file, seems a little complex when you first look at it, it's really not that bad, because what you have is this parallel activity that runs two processes, one showing the status window and one running the main process, and the main process is basically this whole state machine that we're seeing here. So what if we want to dive just a little bit deeper into what is going on inside of these different states and files? Well, let's try and do that. Again, once the process starts, we have the main SAML file, which is the entry point for the automation. That is the file that is run first. And if we focus just on the main process sequence inside of that parallel activity, what we run into first is the init config state, and that then runs a file called init all settings. And that file runs get and check config. And what happens inside of these two files is it is determined if a configuration file exists, and if not, it'll be created on the user's computer, and then a dictionary object will be returned to the main SAML file. That dictionary object is used throughout the automation. If you are familiar again with the Robotic Enterprise Framework, you should be familiar with the concept of a config file. And it's basically the same thing in the Attended Framework, except the configuration options are not stored in an Excel file, but in JSON files, as I showed you earlier. Then once the init config state is complete, we go to the user input form and process state. In this state, two things can happen. We have the display input form SAML file where we display that input form, where we pick the folders that we want to copy or move files to and from. And then we had the form button action file where we decided what action to take based on what button was pushed. Now by default, the display input form is displayed, but as we saw in the deployed version of our automation, when we decided to not show the input form, you can also be taken directly to the form button action. Again, depending on what is going on, we'll run some kind of processing file, and then again a dictionary object with any changes made to the configuration will be returned to the main SAML file, and then will be shown the results form, and that can either run the display result form error file if an error has occurred, or the display result form success file if no errors occurred and the process ran with success. And then once you make a decision to either repeat or close the process, that result will be returned to the main file, and then eventually you run into the end process state and the automation runs to an end. Now, apart from these files that I've shown you here and that we edited a few minutes ago inside of Studio, we of course have the config utility file that we used to actually set up the configuration options inside of that JSON file. So I really hope this helped you get a good overview of the Attended Framework template. The improvements in this version of the templates are pretty big. And this is something that I'm definitely going to use. In fact, I've already started using it in a real automation, and it's really worth putting in the effort, and I hope I helped you understand it better. And of course, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. You're also welcome to answer any questions that other people leave. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell and all of that. And with that, I just want to thank you for watching the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, bye.